Hello and welcome to CoreTalks, CoreAVI's technical podcast series. Today we're going to talk about SOAFEE, which is the Scalable Open Architecture for Embedded Edge Special Interest Group. We have with us today Robert Day, the Director of North America Automotive Go-to-Market at ARM, as well as a governing body representative for SOAFEE, and Neil Stroud, the General Manager of Automotive and Embedded here at CoreAVI. Welcome both.
Hey, Mary Beth. Hey, Robert.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Hi, Neil.
So for those listeners who may not be familiar with it, let's start with a SOAFEE overview. What is SOAFEE? What has happened with it in the last couple of years? And where are we headed?
SOAFEE started in September of 2021, and it's an industry initiative that looks to extend cloud-native software development and deployment to automotive work groups. And so we formed a special interest group, which really comprises of members across the industry, both the software industry and the automotive industry, to really bring expertise into how we can achieve that. And really the first thing we looked at was defining an architecture. And it's an architecture which will enable cloud technologies to be combined with some of the key elements of automotive development, which is things like functional safety and real-time requirements. So SOAFEE is primarily an architecture. It's often known as a framework. And we also have an open source reference implementation that we provide, which allows people to get going with SOAFEE. So since it was founded in 2021, we've put the structure together for, the governing body. And if you go to soafee.io, you'll see the governing body members, but they include automotive OEMs, tier ones, software technology providers, and also cloud service providers, because it's a cloud thing. And what we've really done over the last couple of years is define what it is that we want SOAFEE to do. And as much as anything, it's like, what don't we need SOAFEE to do? Because it's being done by other consortiums or other players in the industry. And also then really went to build the membership up with expertise across the whole industry. And in the first 2 years, we're now at, I think, 105 members that have been announced. And there's still a few that haven't been announced. So we quite rapidly grew the membership. And the nice thing is we've managed to really bring people on from right across both software and automotive industries, so that we've got expertise in all manner of different technologies, methodologies that will essentially allow SOAFEE to meet its goals. One of the key goals we're looking at as we move forward is how do we enable the development and deployment of mixed critical systems. So if you think of cloud native as a development and deployment methodology, if you're just developing cloud instances, you're not caring about functional safety, you don't care about real time. And so when you get to a car and you want to use cloud to develop and then deploy to a vehicle, you actually need to worry about real-time functions, heterogeneous compute, safety criticality. And this all comes into something we call mixed criticality. So that's kind of what we're really looking at doing now. There are some key technologies that we kind of bring into the SOAFEE architecture, which we kind of borrow from the cloud native world. One of which is the concept of containers. And containers basically allow software developers to easily kind of bring their software functions, and if you think about a software-defined vehicle, that's what this is all about, is bring their software functions easily down to the target system using container technology. The other part that we've been looking at is orchestration, which is another technique for basically telling, the tools and technologies where these things have to go. And that's one of the interesting things we're looking at this year, is really trying to understand what we need to do to orchestration standards and technologies so that it understands that this piece of software is going to be running in a real-time system or a functionally safe system or a different architecture to another piece of software. And that's the fun that we're going to be really heading into this year.
That's a great summary. Thank you, Robert. I've got 1,000 questions spinning around in my head, so let's get going.
It was a little bit of a monologue. I'm sorry about that. But
No, that's
so
okay.
Much to say.
Well, it's great because as much as you and I have been involved in SOAFEE for many years, there are people out there listening to this and they'll be hearing this for the first time. So it's good to kind of set that expectation and get everybody level set on what SOAFEE is. So you mentioned automotive a couple of times in the SOAFEE context. Yep. And of course, the EE in SOAFEE is embedded edge, which of course implies that it's not just relevant to automotive. It can be applicable to other areas and other market segments. Is that a true statement?
Yes, you're right. Deliberately doesn't have the word automotive in its acronym. And when we started it, we were talking to automotive customers, we were talking to industrial folks. What we discovered is a couple of years ago that the biggest kind of change in the software world was this desire to get to the software-defined vehicle. So that kind of drove all this. So a lot of the companies that have joined SOAFEE are automotive companies. However, a lot of the tenets in automotive, also apply to industrial, things like real-time safety criticality. And so what we're defining in the SOAFEE framework is not specific to automotive and could be used in other industries. It's currently being driven by automotive and the software-defined vehicle.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, because I think there's lots of transferable technologies, especially when you think about autonomy, that applies equally to robots and a whole bunch of other market segments as well. So I guess there's a lot of innovation happening, as you said, within software-defined vehicle and autonomous vehicles, but that's equally transferable to other market segments as well, which is great. And
yeah,
when I think about,
we're almost starting with the most difficult one. That's the interesting thing, Neil. It's like
yeah.
The most complicated compute device that you are going to own in the next few years is going to be your car, if you own it, but one of that you will interact with. And so doing this first, hopefully we can, all of the lessons that we learn from doing this, we could apply to other industries easily.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, especially if I think about core AVI customers for just a moment, and we're not the only company out there that addresses multiple market segments as well. So, it helps us to scale, it helps our customers to scale as well, which is, I guess, another key benefit of, defining a common architecture such as SOAFEE. So I suspect that's a lot of why the membership we've seen with SOAFEE has increased dramatically over the last couple of years. As you said, it's well over 100 now, so that's great to see. So you mentioned open source as well, almost in the same breath as functional safety, which is always an interesting and controversial thing to say. In my mind, having been involved in the safety market for probably more years than I care to remember, there's been a healthy debate of whether, not if, but when open source and safety come together, or functional safety come together. I think it will happen. I think it has to happen. So how does SOAFEE play a role in that? What are they going to solve with that?
So this is an interesting one, because if we come back to mixed criticality, okay, and especially when we come down to the mixed criticality of different software components running at different levels of criticality in the car, we've already got open source running in our cars right now. It just doesn't happen to currently run in the bit that controls your steering or your brakes or whatever else. But things like your infotainment system make use of, open source technology. So one of the kind of cool things with SOAFEE is we're trying to define, well, okay, if we can get this right and we can separate some of the real-time stuff from the non-real-time stuff, well, maybe you can then separate open source from non-open source. But what we do really see is that a lot of the automotive developers will start developing with open source, but then when they come to their deployment, and because it's quick and it's available, when they come to their deployment, they'll basically bring a commercial offering in. And so that's the reason SOAFEE isn't an open source thing. It has an open source implementation, but the majority of our members are commercial software people. The majority of the software companies are commercial software companies that are there to enable, the deployment of software-defined functions in a vehicle. If it's a need for real-time, you have a real-time OS. If it's need for safety, you have a safety OS or an AUTOSAR OS. All of those parts will all be in the SOAFEE framework and the SOAFEE membership. And what we're trying to do right now is kind of enable the automotive developers to get going now using open source, which is why we've got an open source reference implementation, knowing full well as they get closer to their deployment or even closer to getting vehicle hardware, that they'd move over to a commercial offering. And another key part to this is this whole concept of shift left. So, traditional automotive development is sort of sequential. You develop your SoC, your ECU, your software, whatever. The software-defined vehicle, it doesn't allow for that. You have to bring the software development earlier. And this is what we're calling shift left. Now, what this means is that you're going to have to be developing software before you've got any hardware to run on it. And this is another kind of cool part to how cloud native plays a part, because you can start developing in the cloud. And you can start developing and testing either by running kind of natively in the cloud, which is possible, or by using some virtual prototyping or digital twins that are housed in the cloud. And, the more complex they are, the more fidelity there is with your end system. But the nice thing is the code you're developing, and especially if you use some of these techniques like containerization, you can actually kind of basically obfuscate that a little bit from what your underlying hardware looks like. And so within SOAFEE's world, we're concerned with both the cloud part and the edge part. The cloud part's where you get started. The cloud part is where you do all your development tooling, your continuous integration, continuous delivery, the CI/CD. And then you get to closer to when your vehicle hardware is available and you start then running on things that look more like the hardware that's going in the vehicle. So you've got this interesting continuum. What we're doing is we're starting early. And what we hope that means is that it will shorten the development life cycle for auto developers. Even though they're developing a lot more code, they'll be able to do it in a kind of much more agile way. And the other thing this also leads to is the software-defined vehicle. Currently, when we buy a car today, we drive it from the dealership, and it doesn't really change very much. You'll maybe get updates to your infotainment system and stuff like that, but it won't change that much. Software-defined vehicle is going to be continuously updated and upgraded, potentially with interesting business models between the OEMs and the drivers of their vehicles to actually pay for new features. There's also kind of the description of having seasonal features. So maybe you only need heated seats in winter. Okay, maybe you only need air conditioning in summer. Little bit extreme, but that's where if these things are defined by software, you can take them off or add them on or upgrade them or whatever. And that's where being able to continuously develop and deploy after the vehicle is in the hands of its consumer. That's another really interesting part to this.
So you mentioned shift left, and I just want to go back to that comment because I think that's an important point here, right? Because we know that the traditional automotive market, the life cycle of the development of the vehicle can be 5-6 years, even in some cases, from the start of the development to start of production and the vehicle going out onto the road, which is something we've all been striving to accelerate, no pun intended. And that's good for the consumer. It's good for us as suppliers. It's good for everybody. And it's faster time to revenue, and that there are lots of benefits to doing that. That there are a lot of challenges to doing that as well, of course. So do you think, maybe not as a direct result of SOAFEE, but SOAFEE certainly has a role to play in it, but maybe more as thinking about things in terms of software-defined vehicle. Do you think that traditional life cycle starts to get a little bit blurry and ultimately goes away because of the CI/CD thing that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think the more you can start early, the more you can use things like cloud technologies and virtual prototyping, the more accessible the system becomes to your software developers. So let's say there's an extreme example where you're developing a new function with a box to go in a car in ECU. A lot of the time you can kind of get started, but you're running on hardware that looks a bit like what's going in your box, and then you have to wait for your box to do your final test and validation. And how many boxes you've got then sort of defines how many software people can be working on it. Well, given the whole car is going to be defined by software, you're going to need a lot more software engineers, and they need to have access to something that looks like the vehicle they can develop and test their software in. And that's where the availability of spinning up a cloud instance or spinning up a virtual prototyping instance will be really interesting to be able to sort of compress that timeline for software developers by allowing them to do more stuff in parallel. And I think that's another interesting shift that we're going to see. Greater amount of software means greater amount of software engineers. Greater updatability and upgradability means you have to be able to keep doing this. That all leads into, an architecture that is, really what SOAFEE is trying to define for people to do their software-defined vehicle development.
Interesting. Geographical question for you. We all know how quickly the China automotive market is accelerating, and the speed of innovation and the speed of the development cycles as well. I mean, it's frightening how quickly the Chinese automotive market can go from design start to vehicle deployment. It can be 2 years in some cases that I've seen. So do you think SOAFEE then becomes a competitive edge? And I don't know what the split between Chinese membership is versus other parts of the world.
We do have a number of Chinese companies. We've got a number of Chinese software companies, Chinese silicon companies. We've now got Chinese OEMs involved. And I think what's happened over the last couple of years is people have been watching these different initiatives out there, trying to figure out, which ones make most sense for their development environments and the development and deployment. And I think what's happened is the Chinese automakers and their supply chain, some of which are very specific to that region, have now figured out that SOAFEE could be a really good way for them achieving what they want to achieve. And so they've been getting involved. So when you start a new initiative, there's always this sort of interesting momentum that you have to get enough, let's say enough of our silicon partners involved, enough of the RTOS partners involved, enough of the middleware partners involved for people to go, oh yeah, this thing's real, now I'm going to get involved. And that's what we're seeing, from a geographic perspective as well. So yeah, we are seeing our Chinese companies coming on board with SOAFEE right now.
Okay. Which is great. So, I mean, you can put your hand on your heart and say SOAFEE truly is a global consortium of companies made up of, as you said, OEMs, tier ones, RTOS vendors, software providers, cloud service providers. It's encompassing all of the key pieces that I guess an auto OEM needs to integrate in the future world of SDV.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points there. So firstly, the trouble with being a global consortium or alliance is the time zones kind of play against you when it comes to meeting up, as I know you know. And so when we started, it was primarily North America and European. So we'd have a lot of our meetings in time zones friendly with that, which was not friendly to our APAC members. So actually, a couple of months ago, we did our first APAC seminar where we brought together a lot of the SOAFEE members to come and talk about what they were doing, as well as potential members within the APAC region. And we basically had a live session in Tokyo, face-to-face session in Tokyo with over 100 people there. And I think we had something like 700 people on a simultaneous webcast as well. So there's definitely a lot of interest there. We just have to be a bit more creative, I think, on how we get the time zones. The other part to this is the SDV can't be done on its own. It has to be collaborative. So I think what we're going to see is technologies and tooling and architectures like SOAFEE will actually allow a lot of these different, members of the automotive ecosystem to actually come together and work together. And by using this, these cloud native tooling, you can kind of work together even if you're remote from one another. And that's going to be a really interesting kind of dynamic as more and more companies create more and more software things to go in a software defined vehicle. And then obviously the OEM at the end has to have them all come together. But the development could then be spread not just across geos, but across companies within those geos.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I have to say, that's one of the things that I absolutely love around SOAFEE is that we know that the OEMs generally have a massive headache to solve when you just look at the sheer number of elements you have to integrate from, the hundreds of different software vendors, the silicon providers. That integration challenge is massive. So the more we can get our collective heads together as suppliers into that supply chain to do some of that homework, and we do this all the time as Core AVI. We work closely with the RTOS vendors to make sure that our software works with the RTOS vendors, and the more of that we can do, that's to everybody's benefit. It saves time down the line, that it has value, and it accelerates the innovation as well. So that for us is a key benefit for us and of course our potential customers.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing that we kicked off probably over a year ago. I think it was in the first year of SOAFEE. This concept of blueprints. SOAFEE blueprints, which are essentially, they started off as applications or workloads that would be running in a SOAFEE environment. And the idea was to actually give people real code to run in a development framework in the cloud. And what we found is that by making access to these blueprints sort of readily available, that it's actually got collaboration. It's not just one company that brings the blueprint in. We have a bunch of companies that are all working together. And now what we've found is a bunch of other companies will be taking that blueprint and using it and showing off their own technologies. So a good example of that is if you're a silicon provider, you can take the blueprint and say, okay, this is how it works on my silicon. So what it means is that the end deployable silicon will have these example blueprints running in a SOAFEE environment. Makes it a lot easier for people to get on board, but it also makes it a lot easier for people to collaborate.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, demonstrating those things out of the box is a fantastic thing to be able to do. And then obviously the follow on, which again, from our perspective, we really like, is showing that migration from the blueprint, from the SOAFEE framework to a commercially deployable, safety certifiable end product. So that has huge value.
Yeah, both the hardware and the software. That's the key part. It's like, okay, we've got this example, great. Whether people would use the example to deploy, some of those examples are commercial examples. That's the nice thing, is they don't have to be open source. And then people can kind of go, oh, okay, I can go and get this piece of hardware and run this software, maybe this operating system, and I've got an example application. That's good. That makes my life easy to get started, and then I can focus on my own bits, which are my differentiators as a automotive software developer.
Excellent. So what's next for SOAFEE? I guess you guys, I know, are present at a lot of events, and the SOAFEE membership, of course, also tend to be a lot of events. So I'm assuming you guys are going to be at CES.
Yes. So so CES is becoming a very large automotive event, and it's kind of interesting when we see all of the SOAFEE members that are going to be there, all the demonstrations that they have there, all the discussions about the software defined vehicle and the development and stuff like that. And so we see CS as being a kind of really important event for SOAFEE members to come together, collaborations to come together, and so I think this has turned into a kind of a real automotive event on the calendar now that people don't want to miss.
Yeah, I agree. And we've done CES a couple of times ourselves and had very successful events there. And of course, CoreAVI will be there again in January coming up. So exciting stuff. And what about through the rest of next year?
So the rest of next year, I mean, from an event perspective, there are a number of events where we will have, SOAFEE members and SOAFEE being demonstrated. I think the one after CES is probably Embedded World, although we have an automotive computing conference that we're running for the first time in Detroit in March, called the ACC. It's in its 6th year in Germany, and we're bringing it over to Detroit for the first time. So that's a good place for people to come meet face to face. As far as other stuff we're doing, this is really the year of execution for us. This is where we're going to start taking all the good things that our members have been doing and now coalesce it and bringing it into the SOAFEE architecture, update the standards that SOAFEE wants to use for the development and deployment, and really kind of execute our SOAFEE vision for allowing the mass deployment of a software defined vehicle, even though we're using cloud technologies. The cloud technologies will know that it's going to a vehicle and will deploy safely and successfully.
That's great. I mean, that's the proof in the pudding right there, isn't it? Because there are so many alliances and consortia out there, knowing, for a company, especially for a company like us, which ones do you join, which ones are going to move the needle, how much time do you invest in those things? So I think we've gone from kind of 0 to 100, if pardon the pun, with SOAFEE very quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting if you think about it. 0 to 100 in 2 years is a bit slow for a vehicle, but it's quite fast for a consortium.
Absolutely. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, as it always is. It feels a bit like getting the band back together.
Yes.
As you can hear from us, and as you know already, we're excited and all in on SOAFEE from a company perspective as well. It's great to hear that it's going from strength to strength, and we look forward to seeing what else the group can achieve over the coming months and years. Any parting thoughts for us?
I believe, and I believe this with heart on hand, that people actually want to collaborate with each other now. We've seen it within SOAFEE that people really don't think they can do it all themselves, and they really feel the need to collaborate. And I think alliances like SOAFEE really kind of give people the opportunity to come together and talk about problems that they need to solve without sharing their own secret sauce, but there's just enough commonality that needs to be solved, and I'm hoping the industry will really come together as I've watched over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I echo that. I see the same thing. That's great. Okay, thank you once again, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Great talking to you.
Cheers.
Okay, a special thanks to our guests today, Robert and Neil, for this informative session on SOAFEE, and we hope our listeners are now up to speed on what SOAFEE's working on to accomplish and all the great benefits that it provides. Stay tuned for more technical insights in the next CoreTalks podcast episode in our series. Thanks for listening.